The EU was an institution that was formed basically the day after the war ended. The French woke up, they look around, after 300 years of conflicting with everybody over the future of the continent, they're like, wow, where'd everybody go? The Spanish were languishing under their own dictatorship, the Brits were going home, the Germans were occupied and divided, Central Europe had been blocked off from the rest of the continent by the Iron Curtain. They looked around like, wow, we can totally swim in this pool. The EU formed with the original 6 countries, Germany, France, Italy, and the 3 low states, and was basically formed by the French to be a pedestal to project French power to the rest of the world. It's a good plan. Worked pretty well for a while. Fast forward to 1980, and they started working on the monetary union. The French told the Germans, look, you're not allowed to have an opinion in foreign affairs. Tough. What we will, however, let you do is design the economic union, the fiscal union, the monetary union. And in exchange, we get total control over the political and military union. French did as they were told, designed the euro. Now, what the euro did is kind of fun, because you've got all of these rivers in Europe, particularly northern Europe. They're all navigable, but they're not interconnected. And so each ethnicity of Europe has their own capital base, has their own financial system, has their own banking sector that they do not like to let anyone else use. Here in Canada and the United States, banking makes up roughly 1/3 of our total capital generation. In most of Europe, it's north of 80%, because they don't like foreigners having a say in how their system is run. Even with the European Central Bank, you still have 28 separate banking authorities in Europe, not one, because they didn't want to include that in the monetary union. But the monetary union did allow the capital that was generated to flow anywhere with the zone with a minimum of problems. And so suddenly, back in 1999, when the euro was launched officially as electronic currency, all of the money that normally pooled in Northern Europe suddenly became available to everybody in Southern Europe. And in 2004, when the whole gaggle of Central European states got in, it went to Central Europe. And so states that had no historical experience being capital rich suddenly had exposure to German-style low interest rates. Growth was inevitable. Bubbles were inevitable. Got to dispose of France here real quick. As the union expanded to more and more states, France in the 1990s and the 2000s lost the ability to control the union completely. As a result, the military union, for all practical purposes, is dead. It was stillborn almostly. The political union is also gone. So France, which created this entire structure, is now on the outside of its own mega plan. It's a German institution now. And what's been going on for the last few months and what's going to be going on for the next 5 years is about the Germans trying to revamp the EU into their mold. Let's talk about how they're going to do that. But first you have to understand the Germans, because they're about as different from the Americans as you can possibly get without being Iranian. Get 3 navigable rivers, nice long ones. However, they're not interconnected. And so unless you're going to be fighting among yourselves, you've got to find some physical way of linking this all together. The Germans do this by planning. It's in their blood. The Autobahn, the canal system, all came out of this. Give you an idea of how integrated it is into the German sense of self. In the 1840s, before there was even a modern Germany, when it was just Prussia and 36 other principalities, they were well advanced into integrating their entire system into the first transnational rail network in the 1840s. Not bad. For comparison, in the 1840s, the United States was having a national debate over whether or not we should build a second road. Some of us plan more than others. However, whereas the United States and Canada are all alone, and once we worked out our issues, pretty much didn't have to worry about local defense, Germans always had to. They've got the French on one side, they've got the Poles and the Russian on the other, they've got the Brits hanging offshore, they've got a truncated coast split by the Jutland Peninsula. Kind of a tough neighborhood. So the Germans are always having to be on the defensive, except for when they're on the offensive. And as a result, we had NATO in the EU, designed explicitly to constrain German options and force them into the center of an alliance structure where they were not allowed a say in how either one ran. It was great for a while. It allowed the Germans to rebuild. But the Cold War's over. NATO, for all practical purposes, is a rapidly dwindling institution from the European point of view, particularly from the German point of view. So, the Germans have to plan. They also are up against a deadline. Demographically, they're in a situation somewhat similar to you folks, just a little bit younger, but a lot fewer young people. For now, this is great. Like you, they have remarkably low cost of capital. However, as soon as those people retire, they're going to be facing the same problems that the Canadians will be. But a couple other quirks that make this a lot more important for them. Right now, that red band in the middle is at the height of their productive capacity. They are exporting like mad because nobody can keep up with them. And because they're tied in with the rest of the Europeans, particularly the ones that are having financial problems right now, the euro's not going through the roof like the Canadian dollar is. Nice situation if you're Germany right now. You can export, under the worst of situations, the Germans are organized enough, have the capital base, have the industrial base, have the educational system to compete with anyone anywhere. Now they're doing it with a weak currency. Not bad. But they know they're on borrowed time. The Poles have the same damaged demographic of most of the former Soviet satellites, but they do have a young bulge in the 20-somethings, which means that those people can have kids. You can regenerate the capital base over the long term. Long term being the key word here, because you have to wait for those folks to have sufficient kids and for those kids to grow up and reach the mature worker category. For a state like Canada or Germany, that's a 2-generation job. That's 60 years. For Poland, it's only 30. But the Poles and the Germans both know that if you take the same amount of money, apply it to Poland, your rate of return on your capital is going to be so much higher because they're so much further down on the scale in terms of skills of production. Also, you can pay young people less, which I definitely do for Gen Y. Okay. Let's talk about the German plan. Part 1 is to make sure that nobody in Western Europe has the industrial base capable of challenging you in the long term. This is the impact that the Eurozone has had on the trade structure of Europe. By putting everybody into the same zone, everybody has to compete with the Germans by the Germans' rules, and that's just impossible. So over the course of the last 10 years, you've seen the trade balance shift, with the Germans taking an ever larger piece and the French losing out. Over the course of 10 years, it's been a 5% shift in terms of total EU exports, both internal and external. That might not sound like a lot, but bear in mind that over 10 years, that's 600 billion euro of business that the French have lost and the Germans have gained. Part 2, do this to the labor pool as well. What we have here is unit labor costs going back for the life of the euro. You'll notice the Germans, that bottom purplish line, has barely budged. It's only about 5% higher than it was. The Germans include labor in negotiations, part of their planning model. It's a corporatist system. Labor, capital, government, the military all sit around the table for all major planning. And so they find ways of compensating the labor force that doesn't necessarily impact the bottom line. All your dotted lines up there are the pigs. The only way that Portugal, Ireland, Spain, and the rest have been able to compete with the Germans is by taking out loans to basically cover the difference. That's great for a while, but eventually you find yourself indebted to Germany. Now, the Germans obviously want to get paid back. Get to that in a second. Next, you got to take care of the Polish problem. The Germans want to make sure that 10 years from now, the Poles are not instantly able to step into their shoes. So the first thing they do is absolutely hobbling them with regulations. I think you guys here can probably relate to that a little bit. The quote there says, this is an EC directive listing regulation sizes for molecular structures. There are over 150,000 pages of EU regulation that every new EU state had to adopt on day 1 of membership. It has absolutely crushed entrepreneurial efforts across Central Europe. You're seeing huge swaths of the economy in places like Romania, Bulgaria, and Estonia sliding into the black market because they simply cannot afford to start a business in such an environment. All of these regulations were designed for heavily industrialized, technocratic economies, not for the places that are further east that are still moving up the development scale. Next, the Germans are putting requirements on the new members that the new members really can't afford to pay for. For example, switching everything over to natural gas as opposed to coal. Right now, Poland gets about 90% of their electricity from coal. EU directives, environmentally based, are designed to make Europe as a whole a cleaner place. Laudable goal. However, the Germans are not providing any money for this. So the Poles and the rest are going to have to dig into their own pockets for scarce capital that they don't have, or borrow it, in order to meet EU regulations the Germans are forcing on them but not paying for.